This is Riley and Scott Rewind on News Talk 1440 WROK.
We turn to the Heritage Foundation for another expert. This one is Luke Coffey, the Margaret Thatcher Fellow, the Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom. He is one of those guys, as we have pointed out so often with Heritage, if we were to read his entire resume, there would be no time left to talk to Luke. Let's just put it this way, very impressive credentials. Luke, good morning to you.
Good morning. That's a very kind introduction you just gave me. Thank you very much.
And very, very accurate. We encourage people to get over to heritage.org, look you up, see what you've written about, learn a little bit about you. But in the meanwhile, since we have your expertise, let's take advantage of it. What the hell is happening in Iraq?
Oh, it's a mess, isn't it? What we're seeing now is the result of neglect and from the Obama administration. I mean, they really thought that if they ignored the problem in Iraq, it would go away. Back in December of 2011, Obama said very proudly that we're going to leave behind a stable, secure, and sovereign Iraq. And now fast forward 3 years later, and we have this absolute mess in the region.
Was it not Joe Biden who was supposed to be in charge of working out a training agreement, working out something, a force-in-place agreement after hostilities or after the major drawback, and that crashed and burned?
Yeah, well, this is, I think, one of the biggest causes of the problems and security challenges we're seeing in Iraq today, is that when U.S. forces left in 2011, they did not leave behind a residual force to train and mentor the Iraqi security forces. In Afghanistan today, for example, you can debate the merits of ending the combat operation by the end of this year, but regardless, we're leaving behind a reasonably sized force that will train the Afghan security forces. We did not do that in Iraq. And it was politically convenient for the Obama administration to make it look like that the Iraqis were the ones not agreeing to this, when in reality, the White House didn't really press or push very hard because it didn't fit their political narrative at the time.
Luke Coffey with us from the Heritage Foundation, heritage.org. Tell us, if you can, about this terrorist organization, the militant organization, Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, ISIS. They are Al-Qaeda offshoot, apparently too hardcore for Al-Qaeda. That's what we hear.
Yeah, well, that's what has been reported, that even the main core of Al-Qaeda has denounced these guys. This group, ISIS, as the acronym is said, started out as the Al-Qaeda in Iraq, the Al-Qaeda organization that many of us are familiar with, that the U.S. and the Iraqi security forces were fighting up until 2011. And what happened was, especially starting with General Petraeus' strategy, we became so effective at countering this group that they were literally squeezed out of Iraq in many cases, and they found refuge in Syria. So when the revolution kicked off in Syria, they found a great place where they could, fill a security vacuum, and they were able to do so. Well, during their time fighting in Syria, things in Iraq changed, and the security forces became less capable. There was a new security vacuum in northern Iraq that needed to be filled. So now they've moved back from Syria back into Iraq. So it's a Sunni-based organization, meaning that when they operate in the Sunni areas in northern Iraq, they're sort of welcomed by the local population. But as soon as they start moving further south, closer to Baghdad, south of Baghdad, that's when it's going to get real, when they encounter Shia resistance.
What do they want? Do they want to take over all of Iraq? Do they want a continuous state, part Syria, part Iraq, as the name implies? What is the ultimate goal?
Yeah, well, first we need to consider that a lot of the borders we have today in the Middle East are meaningless to some of these organizations like ISIS, right? These borders were drawn usually by the French and the British during World War I, and they don't really reflect the sectarian divides, the religious divides, the tribal divides on the ground. So you take an organization like ISIS, they see themselves as the rightful heirs and owners of land and territory that transcends many of these national borders. So to them, they don't necessarily see it as Syria or Iraq. They just see it as being that area of the Middle East as being theirs. In fact, the Arabic name for this organization is the Islamic State of Iraq and Al-Sham. That's and it's often said Syria as well, but Al-Sham is actually a historic geographical term which denotes anything north of the Arabian Desert, south of the Taurus Mountains in Turkey, west of the Euphrates River, and east of the Mediterranean Sea. So this is right smack dab in the middle of the Middle East. This is what they think is theirs, and this is what they're trying to take.
Spending some time with Luke Coffey from the Heritage Foundation. He's the Margaret Thatcher Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. So we've got some other players in the region, Luke. You know, you've got Iran sitting there. You've got other nations that are going to be, well, more than a little concerned. Who's playing what part in this?
Yeah, well, you know, there is a big risk that the Iranians could move into southern Iraq and secure some of the Shia holy sites. You know, Iran, of course, is a Shia-dominated country, and Iran sees themselves as the responsible authority for some of these Shia holy sites in southern Iraq. And if they think that the Sunnis are threatening these Shia holy sites, they might very well move in. And let's not forget, 80% of Iraq's oil is located in the Shia-dominated southern part of Iraq. And then you have the Kurds in the north. Now, the Kurds are the third ethnic group in Iraq after the Shias and the Sunnis. And the Kurds have been trying to get an independent state, a state of their own for years, for decades, for almost centuries perhaps. And they're taking advantage of the situation too. In fact, they've captured Kirkuk, which is one of the major oil-producing centers in northern Iraq. They've captured Kirkuk from the Iraqi government, and they're securing it against ISIS. So now they're involved in this. And however this stuff settles down, whenever it does, the Kurds are now going to be in a much stronger position, either negotiating with Baghdad or dealing with the terrorists than they were before. So you have a lot of regional actors, and then you have money coming in from Saudi Arabia, from Qatar. You have Turkey that's concerned by this mess along their border with Syria and Iraq. It could get really messy really fast.
Luke Coffey with us from the Heritage Foundation, heritage.org. It's Riley and Scot on WROK. What about the timing on this, Luke? This has been building for some months now as city by city, ISIS has kind of taken over. They're in the big cities, Baghdad on the horizon. Why is it happening now?
Well, it's happening now for a couple of reasons. Firstly, the political situation in Iraq is so tenuous with Maliki's leadership. He's not been a strong leader. The country's still largely divided along sectarian lines, Shias versus Sunnis, and the Iraqi security forces over the past 3 years since the U.S. completely pulled out of Iraq have not had the mentorship and the support that's required to maintain a certain degree of capability to counter some of these threats. So you mix this deadly, toxic political situation in Baghdad with the incompetence of the Iraqi security forces, and you create a vacuum that needs to be filled. And right now it's being filled by ISIS, who, operating in Syria for the past 3 years, saw an opportunity, and they're taking advantage of it. And they will continue to march as far as their legs will take them, because you know, their spiritual leadership has told them they need to march all the way to Baghdad. Then you have the senior Shia cleric al-Sistani in Iraq today during the Friday prayers called for every Shia man who's able to walk to pick up a gun and head north to encounter these guys. So it's just been a perfect storm of all of these different events in the Middle East that have brought us to where we are today.
Visiting with Luke Coffey from the Heritage Foundation. Luke, let's speculate a little bit. What's best case scenario here?
Best case scenario is that ISIS overextends themselves in Iraq, and they have to they can't consolidate their gains, and they have to pull back closer to Syria, and then perhaps some of the Shia elements of the Iraqi security forces are able to regain some of this ground. But this is basically putting a Band-Aid over it. There's been 1,600 years of sectarian divide between Shias and Sunnis, and it could take another 1,600 years before these two groups learn to live next to each other peacefully. So whatever happens, it's going to be a short-term solution to a long-term problem, but in the best-case scenario, this ISIS operation runs out of steam, and they can't consolidate their gains, and they have to pull back.
Okay, flip side, let's say short term, what's the worst case scenario?
Worst case scenario is Iran moves into southern Iraq, Turkey moves into northern Iraq, the country divides into three parts. You have a wealthy Iranian-dominated Shia area, which has 80% of Iraq's oil. You have a relatively stable and prosperous Kurdish area in the north, and then you have a very poor, lawless Sunni part right in the middle that doesn't have access to oil, that doesn't have access to the sea, that will become a terrorist safe haven.
If you were to bet.
If I were to bet, I would say we're looking at a de facto partition of the country. Not quite as extreme as I just mentioned, but certainly where sectarian rule and sectarian lines along the Kurdish, Shia, and Sunni areas of Iraq become essentially semi-autonomous or separate zones.
Luke Coffey with us from the Heritage Foundation, heritage.org. It's Riley and Scott on WROK. Iraq apparently asked the U.S. for some help, asked for some strikes on ISIS, and we said, let's wait and see, basically. Should we get involved here in any way, shape, or form?
Well, Maliki should have thought about this back in 2010, 2011, when he refused to sign the agreement with the United States that would have allowed us to stay behind to train and mentor the Iraqi security forces. But regardless, we are where we are today. And if we do get involved militarily, we do need to ask ourselves, what can we actually achieve? Dropping some bombs, some drone strikes will not solve the main problem here, which is a sectarian, religious-based civil war, essentially. And should the U.S. get involved at this point in this sort of religious civil war, the case needs to be made. And it needs to be made forcefully with leadership from the President of the United States. And I'm not sure if he has it in him to make the case one way or the other. I think President Obama likes to sit on the fence of these issues and likes to see which way the political tea leaves are, how they are reading before he makes these big decisions.
Which, for the belligerents who are going at it over there, they look at it as a vacuum in leadership.
Yeah, exactly. This is part of the larger disengagement from the Middle East, and now we're having to play catch-up. Now we find ourselves in this very curious situation where we could be bombing the same terrorist group that Assad is fighting, right? So last year we were talking about we might bomb Assad, and now, fast forward to 2014, now we're saying we might bomb the people Assad is fighting. It's just been a complete and utter lack of commitment, focus, leadership. It's been a lack of understanding on how events across the Middle East since the so-called Arab Spring have been really unplaying. This isn't about bringing in Western-style democracy to these countries. The Arab Spring has brought in the ability for these radical forces to gain ground and to make headway, and in some cases become elected into government.
You military guys call it a cluster something, don't you?
Yeah, Charlie Foxtrot is a way of... this is certainly a Charlie Foxtrot, I think, by any definition of the phrase.
Outstanding. Luke Coffey from the Heritage Foundation, man, we really appreciate the time and the expertise, and hopefully you can find time in your schedule to join us again.
Yeah, I would love to. Thanks for having me on.
Have a great weekend.
This is Riley and Scott Rewind. This is WROK.